I called 211.
A free community service that connects you with information about social, health, and government resources specific to Medina County. Call 211 for the info you need 24 hours a day.
211 met my needs. 211 helped my parents. 211 showed me the way. I called 211.
I'm Ed Zackery, Director of the Medina County Veterans Service Office. Welcome to Salute to Service, a show about Medina County and our veterans. What we hope to capture in this program are some of the many achievements, heroic deeds, and sacrifices of our past and present warriors from here in Medina County. We also hope to highlight the many accomplishments that they have continued to make as veterans right here in our community. Again, welcome to Salute to Service. Today I'm here with retired Colonel David Taylor from Medina, Ohio. Mr. Taylor, how are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Call you David, okay?
Yeah, sure.
All right. You were a platoon leader in Vietnam.
Yes.
1969, correct? Mm-hmm. And how long have you lived in Medina?
We moved to Medina in 1972.
So almost right after the war.
Yeah,
or when you got out.
When I got out of the Army and went into the Army Reserve. So been here most of our adult lives.
Now, you're very involved in veterans organizations, mm-hmm. and I know you're involved with the AmeriCal Division Association. You were the president, past president?
Yes, the AmeriCal Army Division was the division I served in Vietnam.
Okay.
And even though I spent many years in the Army Reserve Special Forces, I have an allegiance to the AmeriCal Division because that was my combat unit, and so I spent a lot of time with them.
So let's go back up to 1966, 67, and you were originally you signed up for the draft mm-hmm. as an enlisted man, right? What year? Right out of high school? I mean.
No, I had a couple years out of high school. I got tired of going to college, was bored, and so I decided this thing called Vietnam War was going on and wanted to see a part of that. My twin brother and my next older brother had already been over there. And I wanted to try to get into officer school, but if I couldn't get in, I didn't want to be stuck with a 3-year enlistment.
Right.
And so I volunteered for the draft, and I was fortunate enough to get in officer candidate school.
So you came out as second lieutenant?
I was commissioned as second lieutenant, went to Vietnam, I was a first lieutenant, and in 4 years before I left active duty, I was a captain.
Okay. Now, you recently wrote a book called Our War, mm-hmm. and I just want to kind of cover this book because it's an amazing book. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily your story, but the story of your division, although you are in the book. And it starts off, the first chapter is basically the book of Genesis. And basically starts off in the beginning, just like the book of Genesis. And we know each other. I mean, mm-hmm. we've been friends for a few years now. And when you wrote that book, did your life shape your religious views in any way, and is that why you started out with the book of Genesis, or was it just simply because it's the first chapter?
Well, after the war and as I matured as an adult, religion became an important part of my life. And then when I look back at the chore of writing this book, which is the history of my infantry battalion, the entire time it was in Vietnam, and no other book has been written like that, and this is written in a narrative style.
Right.
So you're with the soldiers in the grass for the 3.5 years we were in Vietnam, and as I looked at that book and I started writing it, the whole story of us being over there kind of mimicked the story of life in a sense, and so that's where I decided, well, everything begins with Genesis, and at the end of the book, everything ends in Revelation.
Revelations, and in the book, I mean, it really starts out about 1965 and goes through 71 in, mm-hmm. in kind of the narrative, although the details are that 3-year period of the AmeriCal Division. There's a portion of the book that kind of gets political and talks a little bit about the changes in leaderships in Vietnam. And we always hear, you know, Vietnam War was you know, kind of ran by politicians and not necessarily the military leaders. But it talks about the change from General Westmoreland over to General Abrams and their philosophies. Can you talk a little bit about how that affected the ground soldier on the ground?
Sure, and it's because it affected the ground soldier that I write about it, because you could see in our own experience as a battalion, when we first went over there, General Westmoreland was in command. His philosophy, having come from World War II, was American firepower. We can win this war for the Vietnamese. It's just an application of firepower, and he pursued what we call the war of the big battalions. Just pile on and fight with the enemy, and eventually kill enough of them with body counts that the enemy would retreat in submission.
Right, yeah.
Body count is a strategy in war, but body count only works if you can kill more than the birth rate of the enemy you're fighting, and that's not a very good strategy in Asia. Then General Abrams came in when our battalion was still there, and his philosophy was, it's got to be about pacification. It's got to be about securing the people so they don't support the enemy. It's got to be about getting the army of South Vietnam to stand up and defend their own country, because in the long view, you can't win it for them. They have to win it for themselves. And so our battalion experience, like others, the types of operations we went on, the tactics we used were a reflection of those two opposite philosophies that Abrams and Westmoreland had.
And that strategy kind of almost, that was a shift in military thinking that's carried on today. I mean, we went from that search and destroy mentality of World War II and Korea and early parts of Vietnam to the pacification security, which basically we're still doing today. I mean, that's what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, is winning the hearts and minds of those people that are out there in those other countries. There's a portion of the book in here that I want to just read a little bit, and it basically, it's talking about a unit they're crossing a bridge, and it's a couple chapters, so bear with me. It says Alpha Company had little choice but to press the fight forward, since its position on the beach left it too exposed. Once soldiers on the other side gained a foothold, Captain Erb and a larger group of grunts dashed over the bridge to add weight to the fight. The Viet Cong got what they wanted. Their trap was set and the bridge exploded from a command-detonated mine. In an instant, bodies were flying in the water and on the beach. 17 grunts wounded, including Richard Horn, a platoon leader, and Captain Erb, the company commander. Alpha Company's grunts received a shocking blow that traumatized everyone. Loyalty to one another and guts and determination took over in the midst of the disaster. Although Specialist 4 Donald Hess's face was bleeding from shrapnel wounds, he grabbed another injured grunt and carried him back to the beach while under heavy fire. He went forward to bring another grunt back and treated both, giving comfort to his traumatized buddies. Specialist 5, John Kester, was a medic who caught shrapnel in the right eye and over most of his upper body. Ignoring his wounds, he organized a medical treatment effort on the beach while under fire, advising the other grunts on the use of field dressings, morphine, splints, and tourniquets. His direction provided order and comfort amidst the chaos. Private First Class Stephen Richards, another medic, was unable to move because of serious wounds, but yelled out instructions for other grunts to efficiently and effectively use his supplies. He was able to hang on long enough for a dust-off to take him back to Chu Lai, but he succumbed to his wounds 21 days later. Richards was 20 and married from Burlington, North Carolina. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star. Now, those two paragraphs talk about the tenacity of the American soldier in a combat situation that even some people that have been to combat areas couldn't even imagine. What's it like to be there?
Well, I mean, sometimes it's just sheer boredom because you don't think you can't find the enemy, or everything looks fairly benign in the area you're searching, and then all of a sudden all hell breaks loose. And that's just the way war is.
Right.
And it certainly was the way it was in the Vietnam War. Sheer moments of terror and then certain periods of boredom. And the leadership and even the average soldier had to be ready for that. because you never knew when something was going to happen. Particularly the junior leadership, squad leaders, platoon sergeants, and platoon leaders. Your mind could not wander. You had to be focused on the mission. You had to be focused on what was going on. You had to think ahead. If we get an ambush here, what's our reaction? As we're moving in this direction, what if there's going to be an ambush up there? What do I do? Do I know where I'm at?
Right.
And unfortunately, that is so imbued in you as a combat leader, it stays with you the rest of your life.
And you know, the cohesiveness in those units, you find, I mean, you see there where it's not about you or me, it's about your buddies. And you see where, you know, Richards laid down his life to save his friends. I mean, and that's what, no one's thinking politics in the foxhole, are they?
No.
They're thinking about the guy to the left and right of them. That's really what's going on.
No broad theory of falling dominoes or stemming the tide of communism. It's all about accomplishing the mission and saving lives.
No, the thing I wanted to point out in that, though, is, you know, we were talking about the shifts in war, and Captain Herb, that was his second tour over there, and he had mentioned in the book somewhere about his first tour. He was over there under General Westmoreland, and he said it was a big battalion fight.
Yep.
And now, coming back his second tour, he talks about how it had shifted to that platoon, squad, infantry fight. And the leaders at that level, I'm sure, saw a shift, because there's a lot more thinking going on for a squad leader, for a platoon leader, a platoon sergeant, when that changed. Now, let's talk a little bit about you over there. You went over there in '69, spent about a year over there?
No, I was a short tour guy.
Okay.
I only spent 4.5 months.
Okay.
I was hit in the head, neck, and ear with shrapnel. One of my men stepped on an anti-personnel mine that I fortunately stepped over, and he hit it, and I got shrapnel in the face and the neck and the ear and everything. Then I had bout of malaria, went to the hospital for that, and then I was shot twice in an action where I was took some men on a helicopter to go in after another helicopter that was shot down. So we went in to rescue them.
2 Purple Hearts, Silver Star. Your wife, Sue, veteran.
I met her at the Fort Dix. She's from the Cleveland area. I met her at Fort Dix, New Jersey, when they sent me home for to get better. She was an Army nurse, and that's where she was assigned. So we met there at the hospital once at a little social gathering, and we used to have a saying in the Army: if the Army wants you to have a wife, they'll issue you one. Well, that's pretty much what happened to us.
And she's a lovely lady. Been married, what, going
40,
on?
This will be 43 years.
So in some essence, getting shot was the best thing that happened to you, right?
Yeah,
Sure.
for sure, because I was very bitter at the time, and I was going to go back to Vietnam and settle some scores. But once I met my wife, I decided there's more to life, and that's not a good way to get started in your marriage. And so we were fortunate to both be assigned to Fort Jackson, South Carolina.
Right, and I know she's very involved with the Medina County Women of the Military and the various veterans organizations, as you are. You know, the book goes on, and it talks a little bit about the end of the war, and one of the chapters is the end of the tunnel. And you know, in reading the book, it was interesting that that chapter started out in 1970, because when most of the time you think of the end of the war, you think of 1973 or 1975.
Yeah.
But it states in there that there was already a shift in the men that were over there, that they knew they were coming home. There was a change. What was that change that you saw on the ground? This was after Tet and everything else, but what was the shift that they saw over there?
Well, the shift that we saw as a battalion was we pretty much had obliterated the enemy. And we had a lot of control over there. We were trying to help the South Vietnamese militia get trained up so they could defend the hamlets. And we did more operations with the South Vietnamese Army, try to get them to stand up a little more. But basically, after the offensive of Tet of '68, the enemy got bludgeoned. And there are some exceptions, some major battles that took place in the mountains. But by and large, the enemy at that point were just trying to hold on until the Americans left.
Right.
And we could sense that. And we had a lot of control there, to the extent that we would be sending out squad-size patrols, squad-size ambushes at night. and use all kinds of tactics on a very small unit level, where to do that in the 1968 time frame, for example, when we were having all these big battles, would be unthinkable. You'd
Right.
get wiped out. But yet we were able to do it end of 69, 70, 71, because the enemy had been pretty well beaten back.
I know General Westmoreland, and I think it was about a year before Tet, he made a big speech at, I think it was the New York City Club, and he was saying that, the war's on the downswing, it's going to be over soon, we're winning, and then Tet happened, within a year.
Yeah.
And then, you go back a couple years after Tet, and you look at it and you go, well, we are beating the enemy. That never got sent home.
No.
And the media never covered that. And the home front back here was much different. We talk a little bit about after the light at the end of the tunnel and the war going to an end, and there's some final sacrifices in here. And I don't want to read the whole book to anybody, but I think this really talks great about the American military person, the military soldier. And the squad's in a firefight, the platoon's making contact, and I'm just going to read this one paragraph. Private First Class Michael Brooks, the platoon's medic, was pumped with adrenaline and made a 150-yard dash from his position to the two wounded men who were pinned down by the fire. He dragged them to a more concealed position. The platoon leader, Lieutenant John J. Robinson, marveled at Brooks' speed. I've never seen someone run that fast, especially with a full pack on. Brooks looked at his jaunt under enemy fire and said, "I'm just doing my job." You could probably take that line and apply it to any soldier from the Revolutionary War up to someone in Afghanistan.
Absolutely,
today.
absolutely. It's all about working together as a team, as a brotherhood, and the dishonor of letting your brothers down. And that's what motivates us in combat.
It's a great country to live in, and there's
Yeah,
a lot of men and women that are out there that are willing to lay their lives down for the freedoms we have back here. At the end of the war, we've touched a little bit about how the media was talking back here and what they were doing, and it wasn't quite the same message that maybe the soldiers were getting over there. How do you think the media affected that war in the end?
I think by and large, Americans are primed, so to speak, for maybe a 4-year war. That's been the way World War II, World War I, the Korean War, and so forth. And when you get beyond that 4-year period, as we did in Afghanistan and Iraq, people get very edgy. And then I think the media starts sensing that. And then they start doing what they usually do, which in my view is kind of take a leftist view of things. And so that's grist for the mill for the media, because they know the American people, after 4 years, they get tired of war. And so then you kind of let yourself wide open to whatever is reported, whether it's truthful or not, whether it's accurate or not.
Right. There was a recent discussion on the Hill about today's war in the Afghanistan and Iraq war, and one of the congressmen had mentioned, well, maybe there should have been a draft, because that would connect America with the war more, because they say that only like 2% of America is really connected to the war. And the conversation was, well, Iraq and Afghanistan wouldn't last 10 years because people would be drafted. And you go back to the Vietnam War, where the country was probably more connected than they are today with the two wars that have just happened in the last decade, but less connected than World War II. And it lasted 10 years. So do you think the draft today would connect America more with the war?
I think the draft is a bit of a misnomer, because if you look at the statistics for Vietnam, not as many were drafted as the modern perception is. A lot of people enlisted. I think the difference was in Vietnam versus Afghanistan and Iraq, where we do give them a lot of support, is that in the Vietnam War, we did not use our reserve forces.
Right.
And we did in Desert Storm, we did in Iraq, we did in Afghanistan. And when you activate your reserve and your guard forces, then you bring the war home to Americans. You don't have to do that with the draft. You can do it just the way we did it. And frankly, it was a shock to the system of a lot of guard and reserve
when they went.
When they first did that
Right.
in the Desert Storm fight, but it needed to happen. It needed to happen. If we're paying them to serve in the Guard and Reserve, then we need to use them.
It's
And
a total force.
it's a total force, and that's what really brought the war, the support of those wars in America, because we engaged everybody.
Now, you talk about support of the war, and you know, I always separate support of the war and support of the troops as two different issues. And America supports its military wholeheartedly today, not like they did during Vietnam or at the end of Vietnam. And the book closes in the book of Revelations, nonetheless. The opening paragraph, or the second paragraph, is there's 5 or 6 guys that are at the air base in Vietnam, and they're getting ready to board the plane to go home. And their command sergeant major is giving them a gift and thanking them, and then basically tells them, quote unquote, when you land, go to Kmart, get some civilian clothes, put them on so that you don't get harmed or discriminated against or anything like that.
Yep.
And that's a major shift from today.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's kind of a conception that everybody has of that whole time period from Vietnam, that the soldiers were mistreated when they came home. And maybe in a large fact that is. There were some that came home to, there's some areas of the country that didn't have that. But how did that affect you, knowing you were coming home?
Well, first, that whole thing about being spit on and being called baby killer and that kind of thing, I've done a lot of study of that subject, and it did happen, but not as much as people are led to believe. But I think what happened is the Vietnam vet that came home, because they didn't get any support from friends or neighbors, maybe the immediate family recognized what they had been through. But that whole idea that they weren't supported from the country brought on that feeling of victimhood.
Right.
And that's why they, even though it didn't happen to them, a lot of them mentioned, you know, and we were spit on and everything else. In my case, it was a little different because I was wounded, and so I was sent back with a ambulance aircraft, first to Kamzama, Japan, and then over through Alaska down to the States to Fort Dix. So I avoided all that.
Right.
It was at a price.
But it seemed like the media almost took that on just like they took on the end of the war, and it just spread with the conception of that, you know, all Vietnam vets were treated poorly. And in essence, if you treat one poorly, you are treating them all poorly, because it's a band of brothers out there.
Yeah. I do want to add one thing. I came back on an air ambulance in a stretcher, and when we landed at Fort Dix at McGuire Air Force Base, we were put on stretchers in a bus and taken to Fort Dix Hospital. And I'll never forget this. I can still see it in my mind's eye. We got there early in the morning. It was still dark out, and the duty officer for the day was this major who came on the bus before they took us off. And you could tell he had been to Vietnam. He had a stack of ribbons, including the Distinguished Service Cross. And he said, on behalf of the commanding general of Fort Dix, New Jersey, and myself, I want to thank you for your service and welcome home. And for me, that's all I required.
That was enough.
And for me, that meant everything. So I didn't have the issues that others had.
Well, I got to tell you, you know, and I've said this before, the Vietnam veteran for my generation, and stepping off of that plane coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan, first hand I shook was a Vietnam veteran. And you guys continued that fight for 20, 30 years and still are fighting it. You've changed a VA healthcare system. You've changed the VA health benefits system. You've changed the country on how they perceive not necessarily the war, but the people that are fighting that war. And I thank you for that. I know there's a lot of my guys, I told my soldiers that, I said, you know, it wasn't like this when I was a kid and those guys were coming home, and a lot of people forget that. So that's important. The book's a great book. Again, it is very intensive documentary reading. It's available at Amazon.com, I believe.
Amazon.com, it's Our War.
Or we can email Dave Taylor here, and he can, you know, somehow
or
get the book.
Call me on my home office number, 330-722-7455.
Okay.
So.
And I just want to, you're back in the community, and you are very busy in the community. American Legion, VFW, the VVA, all the organizations you're doing, you're down at the Honor Guard, at the cemetery. How did the military shape your life today?
It made me think ahead. It made me question everything. and always think of contingencies ahead in my life. It's just the way it was. I know in the Army Ranger School, I had to lead a patrol, and we had to do a patrol order, and I gave little parts to everybody. And because I gave it to everybody, the whole thing just fell apart. And I learned that lesson. And for 20
You were a lieutenant then, though, right?
I was a lieutenant. And for 27 years in the business world, I led a lot of business teams and never did that. Never did that. Did it differently, and we were always successful.
A lot of lessons learned.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Would you do anything different?
I can think of one day I would have zigged instead of zagged.
But you might not have met your wife. I don't know if she'd be happy.
That's true.
Though, so.
I think you have to give some things to the Lord, and it was meant to be. The 5 men I took in on a helicopter, when we went in after that down helicopter, 3 were killed, and I was shot twice. So I'm fortunate to be here today talking to you.
I'm glad you are.
Okay.
Dave, I want to welcome you home and thank you for
very
your
much.
service.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Come on in. Are you all right?
I'm fine. I said I was fine.
Has that been happening often?
I guess.
We brought Grandpa in today. He's been taking quite a few stumbles, taking a lot of falls.
Do you have any idea why that is?
Of course not. I'm the picture of health.
Can you describe your alcohol use for me?
I guess 1 or 2 beers per night.
Grandpa, we've discussed this already. It's been more than a couple of beers per night.
Well, you know, American Geriatric Society says that you really should be drinking no more than 1 per night.
Really? I never knew that.
Yeah, it can counteract with all your medications, and it can even make certain diseases worse, like diabetes, liver failure, congestive heart failure, osteoporosis, and it can really damage your cognitive memory.
Well, what can I do to help it?
Well, you can go to www.hands-foundation.org or call 330-225-4242.